The final item of business is members' business debate on motion 19252 in the name of David Stewart on right to full care to die at home. And this debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on David Stewart to open the debate for around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and could I thank parliamentary colleagues from across the political divide for signing my motion and for supporting this important debate this evening. I'm also grateful for the live streaming of this debate by BBC Holyrood Live. Last weekend, Presiding Officer, I read a moving review of a book by a palliative care doctor describing her work. The author, Rachel Clark, said that a century ago we, and I'm quoting, departed the world as we entered it, among our families, close up and personal, wreathed not in hospital sheets, but in the intimacy of our own home. So being able to die at home, in my view, is a basic human right that accords with the European Convention on Human Rights. And Marie Curie, in a recent opinion poll of Scots, highlighted that 61% would prefer to die at home. And research also by Marie Curie, the University of Edinburgh and King's College London, concluded that if current trends in which people die continue, then by 2040, two-thirds of all Scots could die at home, in a care home or in a hospice, and currently less than half do. However, this is very unlikely to happen without substantial investment in community-based care, including care home capacity. Without this investment, hospital deaths could rise to around 57% of all deaths by 2040. I've been working very closely with Shetland GP Susan Bowie, who recently raised with me her concerns about the gap in hospital-to-home care for patients. And I've received similar reports from other concerned frontline petitioners from across my Highlands and Islands region. Shetland currently has no charities or carers providing hospital-to-home care. Other areas are in the same position, especially rural and remote areas, according to GPs who have made contact with me. One explained, and I quote, "People no longer expect to die at home and choose the community hospital because they're afraid of the lack of support at home. We do occasionally achieve a well-supported death at home, but usually because of extraordinary family commitment." Another wrote, "Patients are unable to die at home even when they wish to do so because of the lack of availability of care. It seems the resource for supporting this has been designed out of the system." And Dr. Bowie told me that previously when someone wanted to die at home, she was able to organise voluntary help for families and caring for their relatives, because children also find it difficult to take care of their parents' personal needs. A list of trained people will be available to help occasionally if required and to give relatives a break. However, that service in Shetland was closed some years ago. Social care could not fill the gap, so there was very little care available in the evenings, at night or at the weekends. And Dr. Bowie continued, "We want to be in our most secure of places, our own bed, attended on by loved ones. Unless health boards and social care are forced to do this by legislation, they may choose not to provide this kind of service. And so home care service for the dying in Scotland are patchy at best." Now, around 10,000 people die in the Highlands and Islands each year, and of those, around 7,700 have palliative care needs. So when it comes to statistics of those who die in a community setting, it has to remember this is not necessary at home, as in the person's own home. It could be in a care home or indeed in a hospice. However, there are challenges around capturing this information. There is no national or systematic data recording on a person's preferred place of care at the end of life. And the measure is, and I quote, "percentage of last 6 months of life spent at home or in a community setting." It has been apparent to me that there is no set-down definition of what constitutes community care, but it appears to be described as everywhere that isn't an NHS hospital. The issue has long interested me, Presiding Officer, is it has fundamental public health implications for Scotland. Now, Parliament has rightly been praised for its legacy policies, including free personal care, the smoking ban and the minute unit pricing for alcohol. A right to die at home could join that illustrious group of legacy policies that parliamentarians and constituents of the future could look back on with pride. Now, in the previous session in Westminster, Lord Warner sponsored a private member's bill a right to die at home. So I believe there is a movement towards this across England and Wales. And in a recent debate by MSP Miles Briggs, I was grateful to the Public Health Minister, Joe Fitzpatrick, for saying that the government would consider enshrining in law the right to die in a community setting. We need to shift the balance so that we not only train more carers and nurses to be available to support people who wish to die at home, but make sure these carers are better paid for the valuable job they do. Parents currently have the right to have their child born at home, and the National Health Service provide midwives, but we do not have the right for carers to enable us to die at home. I see a real policy gap there. And again, to quote Susan Bowie, she said, "I almost dread someone asking to die at home at the minute because we struggle to find the compassionate, round-the-clock care they need for the last few days of their lives. Even if folk have caring relatives willing to help, relatives can become exhausted and need a break, and it can end up that the dying person ends up in a hospice, a care home, or even a hospital because we can't access enough care to allow it. It would be a huge relief to me and many other GPs across Scotland that when someone says they want to die at home, we know for sure we can get the compassionate care to back up the palliative care we could provide." So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the right to die at home is, as the Sue Ryder Charity has said, embedding human rights in end-of-life care. It's realistic medicine in practice. It's about the right to express a preference and the right to change your mind if circumstances change. The Scottish Government strategy on palliative care will be complete next year. Surely now is our chance to put end-of-life care at the top of the agenda. And as President John F. Kennedy said, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past and present are certain to miss the future. Thank you.
We move to the open debate, and that's speeches of 4 minutes, please. I have Alistair Allen, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Presiding Officer, may I firstly thank David Stewart warmly for securing this debate today. This is not an easy issue, but it is an important one. I welcome the focus which this debate can hopefully bring to some of the issues, and not least those issues faced by terminally ill people in the Highlands and Islands. As other members will have no doubt point out, dying is a taboo today in a way that it was not for an earlier generation. Scottish literature is full of accounts of unabashedly matter-of-fact family arguments in front of, or in some cases including, elderly relatives about the future catering arrangements which the family thinks adequate for that person's funeral. Conversations as pragmatic as that would, perhaps not completely without reason, be considered fairly shocking today. However, there is good reason occasionally in Parliament to break this modern taboo about dying, because unless we do, as a society, we risk ignoring a crucially important issue for everyone, ourselves included. As we will learn, I suspect, from other speakers in the course of the debate too, 70% of people would choose to die at home. And it is, of course, not always possible for everyone to be cared for at home in their last days. So I quote that statistic in no way to detract from the outstanding work which hospices, doctors, nurses, homes for the elderly, charities and many other people do to care for people. I think as an example of the enormous commitment shown by the Bethesda Hospice, among other organisations in my own constituency. What is a reality, however, is that most people, given the choice, would not choose to spend their last days on the ward of a hospital for want of any alternatives, although I am sorry to say that that does sometimes still happen. In fact, only 25% of people who died in 2017-18 did so at home. Some of the challenges are, of course, the same ones faced by people elsewhere in the country, but some of the challenges are very definitely different in the Highlands and in the islands in particular. In the islands, terminally ill people and their relatives face journeys of a totally different order of magnitude to anywhere else in the country just to meet hospital appointments. In the Highlands and Islands, finding a care package at home is often a difficult task, not for any lack of willingness on the part of very dedicated care workers, but because of the extreme difficulties faced in recruiting them in some places. Some care workers face 50-mile round trips and more in a day as a result. And while this debate is of itself not going to solve any of these challenges, it can at least helpfully identify them. Following the completion of the current strategic framework for action on palliative care in 2021, I hope we will start thinking ahead to the continual improvement we can make to services beyond that. Part of that challenge, to which, again, I do not claim to have the answer, is certainly going to be finding new ways to meet the urgent recruitment challenge now affecting many sectors in the Highlands and Islands. But another is ensuring that everyone who needs palliative care is identified with a right to express a preference for where they would like to be cared for and where they would like to die. And this should include the right, of course, to change their mind. Presiding Officer, I want to conclude really by recognising again the great work which is already happening to make these aims a reality, but to recognise also the distance still to be travelled to make sure everyone is treated in the way in which they would hope to be treated themselves.
Beatrice Wishart, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. I too would like to thank David Stewart for bringing this very important debate to Parliament. I'd also like to thank Dr Susan Bowie, one of my constituents, for her work in raising awareness of the realities of palliative care in the islands. She's highlighted the inconsistency that we have the right to be born at home, but not the right to die at home. Death comes to us all, and like childbirth, everyone's experience is different. It's personal and it's intimate. And I believe that when someone wishes to die at home, they should be able to do so. I know of people who have lived all their lives on a small island, but who were flown out in the last few days to hospital to die. They received good hospital care, but were deprived of the presence and loving support of extended family, friends and neighbours. I'm sure that everyone in the chamber has a personal story to tell about their experience of the care of loved ones in the last few days, but it's often our personal experiences that shape our thinking. My father felt guilty because he hadn't fulfilled his mother's wish to die at home. She died in hospital some 40 years ago. When his turn came, he died at home. That we were able to care for him at home was only because one of his close friends was a retired nurse who supported the family through the practicalities of dying, along with a locum GP who administered pain relief. My father remained in good spirits up to the end. It was a good death, and really that's what this is about, is it not? Ensuring that everyone has a good death, one that is free of pain, fear and suffering, one that helps family and friends to understand and come to terms with the loss of their loved one. Creating a right to have a full care at home at the end of life is something that should be fully explored, and I welcome further debate on the issue. In the meantime, there are things we can do now to make improvements to end-of-life care. Lack of data is a real issue. Children's hospices across Scotland estimate that 2/3 of babies, children and young people who die from a life-shortening condition in Scotland each year are unknown to them. I mention this not only to show that families are missing out on care at such a heartbreaking time, but also as a reminder that palliative care is not just for the elderly. If we don't have the data, we can't plan properly for demand and resources. We are playing catch-up when it comes to end-of-life care. Ideally, we would all get to choose how, when, where, and with whom we die. Obviously, life does not always afford us the choice. For those of us who do have the capacity to choose what death looks like, the choice should never be made for us by constraints in the availability of palliative care. Thank you.
Rhoda Grant, followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I also thank David Stewart for bringing this important debate to the Chamber and pay tribute to Susan Bowie for raising the issue on behalf of her patients and indeed of the wider community. It's not so much about dying at home, it's more about living at home. When days are few, they are very precious. and there is a greater need to live them to the full, to savour and appreciate the things around you, and that is much better to do at home than in an institution. There is also a greater need to spend time with family and friends, although a terminal illness can make that tiring. Therefore, how much better to be at home where family and friends can have somewhere to wait until their loved one has the energy to spend some time with them. In a hospital, that becomes difficult, sitting by a bed, getting in the way, and with nothing else to do than simply just sit. The Marie Curie briefing suggested a number of reasons why people do not die at home. People with cancer are much more likely to get that opportunity, and that's down to organisations such as Marie Curie and Macmillan, who are associated with cancer and are much more likely to be contacted for help and advice by people with cancer. Other terminal conditions are not so well supported, such as heart failure, COPD and dementia. And we need to talk about end of life in order to be able to have end-of-life care that we would wish. People with terminal cancer are more likely to get that support, as I said. I was recently at a conference about dementia in the Western Isles, and one of the speakers made a huge impression on me. He was living with dementia. He wanted to continue to live at home as the condition progressed and was actively making plans to do that. He was learning about what that progression would mean for him and what he could do to make sure that he could live as independently as possible by using technology to guide him as his memory failed. This type of planning is something that people with cancer do and are helped to do. However, with conditions like dementia, we don't speak about what end of life will be like and what is likely to happen and how, therefore, can we plan for it. Marie Curie also spoke about carer breakdown being a reason for people not being able to die at home, and how desperately sad for those involved. Having a loved one die at home and being able to help that loved one really does help with grief. However, if the whole burden of that care is thrust upon the carer with no support, they can't continue indefinitely. They do not sleep for fear that their loved one needs something, and exhaustion sets in, and nobody can keep doing that. The carers legislation made a promise to carers that they would get support, they would not be forced to give up work, but these promises are being broken. I have a constituent whose partner is being forced to give up work to care for him, and even at that it would appear that he will not get the support he needs to allow him to spend his final months at home. To live these days to the full, he needs to be at home. He desperately wants to be at home, and he's being failed. Marie Curie said the situation was worse in remote rural communities due to the lack of support available. And I believe it is true, but I also believe GPs like Susan Bowie and health and care staff in these communities often give above and beyond to support people to live and die at home. When my father was in his final days, it was his desire to be at home. And that could not have happened without the support of health and care professionals that made themselves available 24/7. And they should not have had to do that. There should have been better backup for them, but I will be forever grateful that they did it. Presiding officer, we can't leave it to chance. We need to put plans in place to allow people to be supported at home and to end their lives where they lived it.
Ryan Whittle, followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank Dave Stewart for bringing this debate to the Chamber and giving us an opportunity to discuss this very important topic and difficult topic again, following on from Miles Briggs's debate that was a few weeks ago. And I think the interesting thing about coming back and revisiting that is it gives us the opportunity to put it into context, to maybe think about, post that debate, trying to put into context what we're discussing. And after listening to Rhoda Grant there about how when her father had died at home, I was thinking in myself. I know that I've spoken before about the hospice. My grandmother died in the hospice in Ayrshire Hospice. I was looked after fantastically well. But then I thought about my grandfather after that, who, of course, was then living on his own. and he was a wonderful gardener. He was incredible. In fact, he was a market gardener. He had this incredible garden in Symington that looked out over the fields, and he loved being there. And that is, we were quite lucky in that respect, because at that time I was still taking part in sport, and I had time every day to drop in, you know, and check on him, usually around lunchtime, just to make sure he was eating properly and whatnot. Always try to find him in the garden. But he contracted accelerated dementia, which I think Rhoda Grant was mentioning there, and my father, who was self-employed at the time, him and I managed to spend a bit of time with him every day. But he eventually had to leave his home and go into a hospice or a care home, where he ultimately died. And I think that, you know, what we're talking about here is this right to be in an environment where you feel at home. This right to die at home. And I think, for me, that, just to put it into context, I'm quite sure if we could have done that, he would have much rather have been looking out over the garden that he tended for decades, and you know, that would have been his choice. But at that time, there wasn't the support in the community to help us there. And I think that what's interesting in this, we spoke about this last time, is the direction of travel we're trying to go in here is towards community care. It's taking the services into the community. And as the Marie Curie report highlights, that there will be a significant increase in the numbers of people who will die outside of a hospital setting. And we need to consider how we create a system that will adequately enable that to happen. You know, the projections suggesting that 2/3 of people will die outside of a hospital setting. And when I read the Marie Curie report, one of the things that struck me was the idea that substantial evidence base showing that terminally ill people who receive support at home from community palliative care teams increase the chance of people getting the opportunity to die at home. But also the evidence just that shows that hospital admissions become more likely when there's insufficient available nursing provision and family carers to deliver that care at home. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about developing a system that currently doesn't exist. And I think the care home sector already plays a huge role in the care of those in the twilight years, but it's already under extreme pressure, as we are all aware, with care homes closing within our areas, putting the system under greater strain. So I think there has to be a fundamental change in how we fund care homes, because the way that care homes are now used has changed over the years. I mentioned the last time that decades ago they were often seen as or under the name of granny farms. I think these days the care homes you enter a care home later in life with a much more complex health needs, and we need to recognise that skill set that is now required. I think Dave Stewart mentioned there's a skill set required for care home workers. It's much more of a nursing intervention, much more of a medical intervention than it ever was in the past. So that, I think we have to recognise that. I've met with several care home operators who are struggling to stay open. So I think we have to look at the way in which they operate, we have to look at the way in which they're funded, and we have to make sure that they have a little bit of room for manoeuvre, because...
Come to a close, please.
I'll come to close. So, Presiding Officer, I think the care home environment is something that we're going to have to look at much more closely. If this is the direction of travel, I think that we all wish to move in. Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Monica Lennon is the last contributor in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I congratulate David Stewart for securing this important debate on a topic that I know he feels very strongly about. I support the motion and I welcome the interest from members right across the chamber, and it's been very moving to hear members pay tribute to Dr Susan Bowie and to her dedication to her patients. I think we are blessed to have so many GPs, nurses and other healthcare professionals in our communities, and in particular I want to say thank you to Marie Curie, to all the nurses and volunteers for their invaluable work supporting people living with a terminal illness, and of course supporting their families too. Everyone should have the right to express a choice as to where they receive care and where they die. And many members have talked about the importance of home as a happy and familiar place where friends and family and neighbours can gather. So when you think about that, it's unsurprising to learn that when asked about their end-of-life choices, more than 6 out of 10 people in Scotland said they would prefer to die at home. And the same YouGov survey indicated that less than 10% of people would wish to die in a hospital. David Stewart has made the really important case for vital investment, because without that, we won't be able to meet people's wishes. And 20 years from now, more people will be dying in hospital. And Marie Curie has backed this up. They've given lots of extensive supporting evidence to make the case for substantial investment in community-based care, including care home capacity. I think we all agree there is a principled case for a rights-based approach with dignified, person-centred care at its core. But there is also an economic dimension to this. And I know, well, it's encouraging that the Scottish Government is considering enshrining the case or the right to die at home into Scottish law. We know the pressures on our health service, and supporting people in the community with palliative care services is proven to create efficiency savings because it does reduce the reliance on acute settings. And Marie Curie have highlighted that their service users are much less likely to use all forms of hospital care, including attending accident and emergency. So it makes sense on so many levels. And Marie Curie do know what they're talking about, having cared for over 7,500 people in Scotland with a terminal illness last year alone. And in my region, that amounts to 568 people in central Scotland. And over 90% of those were supported by Marie Curie to die in their place of choice. In Forth Valley, we have 7 Marie Curie nurseries with 48 Marie Curie nurseries in NHS Lanarkshire. But with more investment, we can see more specialist nurseries and more people will be able to have their wishes respected. It's been really interesting for someone from central Scotland to hear so many members talk about some of the unique challenges in Highlands and Islands. And I think there's a lot there that I'm sure that the Minister will want to pick up on. In Lanarkshire, where I live, we've had some recent damning care inspectorate reports which highlight that some of our care services are in crisis. We've had home care services in Hamilton, for example, deemed unsafe for both service users and care staff, and that's from the Care Inspectorate. So we do have some really serious challenges to address, and continuous cuts to funding will only put councils further and further closer to breaking point. So there are many reasons to be grateful for the vital services provided by Marie Curie, for example, but they also have to fundraise £15 million a year, and that's not easy. So we have to get our priorities right. I'm really grateful to David Stewart bringing this motion forward. I wasn't able to be in the chamber for Miles Briggs's debate, but it's clear that there's a consensus growing in the Parliament, and the Minister's already given a commitment to look at legislation. Hopefully we can continue to work together and build on this consensus.
And I call on the Minister to respond to the debate. For around 7 minutes, please, Mr Fitzpatrick.
On behalf of the Scottish Government, can I start by thanking David Stewart for bringing the motion to the Chamber, and also to colleagues across the Chamber for their thoughtful contributions, particularly those who have shared their personal experiences. It's not something I tend to do, and I'm not going to do that today, so I know how difficult it is for folk to do that, but I can say that particularly Rhoda Grant's speech caused me to remember sometimes about some close family members that I'd lost, and the circumstances around that. So, as I say, it's not something I'm in a position to talk about, but I thank those who have had the courage to share their own experiences. Also want to thank Monica Lennon for raising the fantastic work that Marie Curie does on behalf of us all, and working in partnership with the Scottish Government. They're an amazing organisation, and I just don't know what we would do without them. So just add my thanks to them. Members may recall when I spoke on the Miles Briggs debate just a few weeks ago, and it's clear from the contributions today and in the previous debate that we all want the same thing for people to get palliative and end-of-life care that, as far as possible, respects their wishes and reflects their individual circumstances. As we've heard, a recent YouGov survey commissioned by Marie Curie found that in Scotland 61% of people said they prefer to die at home. However, according to the most recent available statistics from ISD, we know that only 25% of people actually do go on to die at home or in a homely setting. And it's therefore important that we take the time to understand why people are not getting the care that they want, and how we can meet that care needs more effectively, a point I think made by Alistair Allen. In the debate motion and in the debate, David Stewart talks about how we should give the automatic right to have full care at home day or night for the last few days of life. And the Scottish Government has long been clear that ensuring that everyone in Scotland can live with human dignity is an essential part of our approach to public policy in Scotland, and that includes providing care and support which is dignified and compassionate throughout our lives and also when we die. The provision of effective and compassionate palliative care forms part of our wider commitment to a healthcare system which seeks to ensure that everyone in Scotland enjoys their human rights to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and which respects, protects and fulfils human rights in general. And I think Rhoda Grant turned the argument on its head and talked about a right to living at home. The health and social care standards, which came into effect on the 1st of April 2018, were designed using a human rights-based approach and that act as a universal standard for how all health and social care should be delivered. They seek to ensure that individuals are treated with respect and dignity, and that human rights we're all entitled to are upheld. And I think if we look on the internationally, Scotland's palliative care provision is world-renowned because of its human rights approach, which we should all rightly be supportive of. And absolutely, we have to support a human rights-based approach to all care, including end-of-life care, where dignity, compassion and respect are central to a person's care, and where people's care wishes are respected as far as possible. However, it's only by understanding the specific needs of our communities better that we can plan palliative care services to meet the needs of the individuals in them. And a number of members, including Alistair Allen, Dave Stewart, Rhoda, mentioned where that isn't always the case. But individual authorities are working with local communities and building on the expertise of clinicians and third sector organisations to commission services that are truly designed to meet the palliative and end-of-life care needs of their local communities. But as I said, we know there are challenges associated with delivering this type of high-quality palliative care at home, and there can often be more acute for rural communities, as reflected by Dave Stewart and Alistair Allen. But with challenges, there are also opportunities. So Dave Stewart and Beatrice Wishart in particular raised the specific example of concerns relating to the availability of out-of-hours palliative care services at home in Shetland. At the end of last year, Shetland IGB informed the Scottish Government that they'd produced a local palliative care strategy and accompanying action plan to improve the availability of care across Shetland. That was signed off just last week, so I'm assuming that it's not yet been published, or if it is, it's hot off the press. So it kind of makes this debate and these points really important. But it does show that the IGB in Shetland have been listening to the debate. The strategy that they've produced wasn't drafted in isolation, but rather by frank reflection that there needed to be more options for people when considering what palliative care is right for them, and by listening carefully to the views of clinicians such as Dr Bowie, MSPs, the third sector, and most importantly the local communities as to what they want from this service. And I guess that's a blueprint about how you should go about shaping services that other IGBs might want to look at. Although there is clearly much work to be done, I look forward to seeing how that plan in Shetland is implemented and progressed in the future. It's also important for us to ensure that nationally the conditions are right so that local work like this can be taken forward. Monica Lennon talked about the amount of spend, and our ambition is to help ensure people to get the palliative care that is right for them in the community setting. And that was reflected in our budget in the current year, which provides investment of more than £700 million to support social care services and speed up the pace of integration. I'm aware that obviously discussions on the budget are ongoing, and it wouldn't be appropriate to preempt those discussions. However, we are on track to deliver our commitment that more than 50% of frontline NHS spending will be shifted to community health services by the end of the Parliament. And I guess the question is, what does that mean in practice for people? And one of the indications, I think Rhoda Grant talked about, the amount of time people are managing to spend at home before death. And over the last 9 years, the percentage of time spent at home in a community setting has gradually increased from 85.3% in 2010-11 to 88.1% in 2018-19. So while some of those people clearly are not dying at home, they are managing to spend a greater period of that time in a homely setting. So that's a good indication of direction of travel. Dave Stewart and Beatrice Wishart both talked about the need for data in this area, and they're both absolutely right. Data is vital because that's what gives the tools to local communities to see what they need to commission services and meet the needs of people in their communities and their care plans. So without that, developing those care plans remains difficult. So that's why government have tasked ISD with clarifying the data requirements to support integration authorities in the planning and commissioning of local palliative and end-of-life care services. And I think that's really important. Additionally, working with ISD, our palliative and end-of-life care data group are investigating a number of areas where data collection can be improved, as well as exploring ways to capture more information relating to the quality of care that people receive. So that will help us and IGBs develop appropriate services, but it will also help inform debates like this in the future. Presiding Officer, in closing, I'm optimistic that through some of the work I've outlined, we will see more and more people getting the end of care life that is right for them in the setting that they choose. Thank you.
That concludes the debate, and this meeting is closed.